Okay, somehow, some way, I am going to make this happen, my friends. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and if you're new, welcome to you, and everybody else, how are you? Are you doing okay? I kind of need your help this week, I'm afraid. I'm not doing that good, everybody. I'm not doing that good, okay? In fact, right now, I am coming to you from my bed. I'm in bed. This has never happened in the 4+ years of doing this show that I've recorded whilst in bed. Normally, I would be in the studio or at least go up in the attic, but I'm not feeling good. I'm not feeling great, and I was comfortable here in bed, and my wife took my daughters out for a couple hours, so this is like the last little window of time to do this, and I didn't really want to go up in the attic. It was going to be uncomfortable, and I'm in pain, and I just wanted to stay in bed. So I'm staying in bed, okay? That's what's happening. I'm coming to you from bed, okay? That's what's happening. I hope that's okay. Now, the reason I'm in pain is it's the same old shit. It's the same old shit, everybody. It's the same old shit. Some of which we're going to get to today in my conversation with Jay Fields, which I'm going to tell you about shortly. But right now, I have a lot of neck pain. And this is not a new neck pain. I've had this one before. In fact, it's one of my first. It's an oldie. Hasn't been around in a long time. But I didn't do anything. You see, I didn't even do anything physically to set it off. This is a pure psychosocial thing because for the last few weeks, I've been really working and putting in a lot of effort to get this video project going, this new video project I'm working on. And it involved shooting a half dozen people and myself doing this new version of the program that I teach. And, you know, I've really been doing what I need to do, eating what I need to eat, sleeping as much as I need to sleep, taking good care. And like, I was ready. Last week was a first scheduled shoot. I was ready. We were going to do it in 3 days. And then Josh got sick and we had to cancel 2 out of the 3 days. So we only did 1 of the 3 days. This week, we were going to make up and do all the stuff we didn't get last week. So we had 2 days to do this weekend. And the first day went amazing. We got 5 out of the 7 people done. The only 2 people we didn't do was me and Josh. And we were going to do that yesterday. Well, guess what happens? I'm scheduled to go in and shoot at 1. I'm going to do 2 passes. I'm going to do one at an afternoon, and then we're going to do an evening pass too, because we wanted the light change, right? So I'm ready to do it. I feel like a little bit of tweakiness because it was a long day the day before, but I'm feeling pretty good. I'm ready to go. And 3 hours before I'm scheduled to start, the power for the entire block that my studio is on goes out. 3 hours before I'm supposed to start, and it doesn't come back on for 10 hours. And like throughout the day, I like started to feel this pain in my neck because I just think I had worked so hard to be ready. And then it was like, what the fuck? And ultimately, come like the evening time, my neck was bothering me. And I was like, I can't believe this. I've been ready. And then, of course, the power came back on when we had like a couple of hours that we could have tried to squeeze in. And I was like, not ready. I was like in pain. I was like, I can't even do stuff right now because I can do some of the modified stuff. But it basically turned into a whole clusterfuck the whole day. And I woke up this morning just totally laid out. Like the universe was like, sorry, dude, you're done. You're done. And it's not the end of the world, whatever. We're going to reschedule if we're going to shoot more, if we need to shoot more, and whatever. The release date gets pushed back some, but that was it. Like if we were trying to get everything shot before the end of the year, and now the holidays are here, and then I'm traveling, so it's gonna get pushed back, and it's fine. It's fine, but you work hard on something, and then so it feels like some forces that you have no control over sabotage it, and that sucks. But why am I bothering all of you with this? I don't know, because that's what I needed to do in order to make this happen, because I didn't even really feel like doing this. And this is, those of you who've been around a long time, no, it's been like maybe 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 tops in the last 4 years where I don't even feel like recording to get the podcast out, but I have to. Well, this is kind of one of those moments. That's why I indulged myself to just stay in bed, because I felt like if I gave myself a little added comfort, it would help me. And it is the fact that I'm in bed and that my cat Willow is here purring next to me. Yes, everybody who's been asking, the cats are doing wonderful. Willow is being very sweet. That is helping me. Those are things that helped me make this happen. And it's a good thing that I am managing to do this, because I have a really wonderful talk to share with you today with Jay Fields. And I have never met Jay before this conversation. I talk about it some with her. A listener suggested that I reach out to her. And when I looked her up, I remembered this book that she had written many years ago called Teaching People Not Poses. And it triggered all these memories for me. So I reached out to her, and it's a really wonderful follow-up to the last couple weeks. Those of you who've been listening, we've been talking about, some of the issues with somatic dominance and teachers really exploring new ways of teaching and new ways of languaging their classes and trauma sensitivity and all of that. Well, it turned out that this conversation I had with Jay really spoke to that in a wonderfully proactive way, in terms of what are we actually talking about and what are we actually doing. If we're not making it about poses and alignment, then what is it about? Because that's the enigmatic thing. And also, the teachers in my teacher's class and I have been having this ongoing conversation around how do you invite someone into their own experience if they want you to tell them what to do, right? So in any case, I ended up really covering a lot of this and way more with Jay, and I'm very excited for you to hear it today. Before we do, let me just drop some of the tour dates. Some of you know, maybe some of you don't. I am going to be out and about some in 2020 doing Gentle is the New Advanced Easing the Pain 2020. And this is a 2-day intensive that I'm offering. And I would very much love for you to join me. I'm going to be in London, England, January 11th and 12th. I'm going to be in Vienna, Austria, January 15th and 16th. I'm going to be in Berlin, Germany, January 18th and 19th. I'm going to be in Las Cruces, New Mexico, February 8th and 9th. Sarasota, Florida, March 21st and 22nd. And Austin, Texas, April 11th and 12th. And let me just say, these gigs are going to be smaller size groups. They're not going to be the bigger groups. There's some limited space. So if you're considering, you might want to register sooner rather than later. To do that, go to jbrownyoga.com/tour. That's jbrownyoga.com/tour. Okay, y'all. I think that's going to be it, okay? Because, like I said, I need to get this done and out to you, and I need to go back to doing as little as possible and trying to nurse myself back to a better state. I will still touch base with you on the other side. I'd like to tell you who's coming on next week, but for now, let's go ahead and get to this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Jay Fields. Hello?
Hello.
Hi, Jay.
Hey. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
I do, yes.
Okay, well, I think
I was trying to work out my my mic and all of the settings. So I think I have it with the input and the feedback and all that stuff.
I think that's good. Well, it sounds good on my end, and if you can hear me and I can hear you, then I think
good.
we've pacified the tech gods well enough to
Let us hope.
make this work, you know?
Yeah.
Well, thanks for giving me a bit of your time. It's fun to get a chance to talk to you.
I am so excited for this. I've been, I was listening to some of the most recent podcasts and I was getting all fired up. So I was like, I can't wait to have my own conversation.
Well, you know, it's funny. Sometimes the way the guests that are coming on are happening have to do with a combination of things. One, listeners are emailing me. So somebody emailed me about you and said, oh, I did a workshop with Jay and you should talk to her. You guys should get along great, I think. And
that's so cool.
yes. And then, but see, what then happened is when I put them in a folder and I get backed up sometimes, but when I go through the folder, I start looking at these, recommendations that have gotten sent in. And when I looked at you, I had like a flash of memories. And that's a lot of what this has been about too. This show's like me kind of remembering things.
Yeah.
And I remembered you first. I saw that you wrote that book, Teaching People Not Poses. Mm-hmm. And I remember when that book came out, but that book came out even just a little bit after. I think you also were like a bit of a blogger, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Like you were a bit of that yoga blogosphere that I was a part of. Mm-hmm. We didn't interact directly, but I did a little searching, and if I found it right, you were, what was it? Grace and Grit Yoga. Grace and Grit Yoga. Do you know what graceandgrityoga.com is now? Have you looked at what that domain is lately?
Someone took it over, didn't they?
Well, getting ready to talk to you, I clicked on it, and it's basically like a Chinese website for like professional sports stories or something. It's a really
my God. I just went to it. I had no idea.
But isn't that like
I totally run that, by the way. That's mine. That's what I'm into now. This is what I'm going to talk
You're running
about.
like Chinese clickbait farms?
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. But what it made me think is that things have changed so much, that's the theme of the show a lot, is how there was this progression, and I'm thinking back to those yoga blogosphere days, and Yoga Dork doesn't exist on the web anymore either. I just noticed today getting ready to talk to you, and I was like, wow, the blogosphere days have really gone.
Yeah.
But we all moved on. And you were somebody, again, even back then when I saw your book, which at the time, honestly, I was pretty snarky. It was blogosphere days. Mm-hmm. I thought was like, this is really simple. Like, it was very simplified. But when I look back at it now, it was way before its time.
Right.
But I think, it's interesting how things have changed. And one of the things that I've been talking a lot about on the show here, which I think is pretty dear to your heart, is we've been talking about the difference between like a postural, structural, biomechanical model of the body and a biopsychosocial model of the body.
Yes.
And I noticed that you have a degree in psychosocial health and human movement that dates from 1998 to 2002.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about that. Is that a biopsychosocial or just a psychosocial, or is there differences?
At that time, it wasn't biopsychosocial.
Yeah.
It was, because all the neuroscience research and everything that we understand about neurobiology now wasn't really out there. Kind of the only, I just totally blanked on his name, but there wasn't a lot of even talk about the body-mind at that point. But I got into that degree because I had already started teaching yoga. I had started teaching yoga in 98, and I was paying my way through college, and I was floundering. I couldn't find anything I wanted to study. And I was like, you know what? I just want to be a yoga teacher. I don't need a degree for that. And one of the deans at William & Mary, where I went, she said, I think you're a smart girl, and I think you're also an adventurer, and I think if you leave school, you're going to probably go on so many adventures you won't come back and you'll regret it at some point. So she said, if you want to be a yoga teacher, why don't you design a degree that would make you the best yoga teacher you could be? What do you need to know in order to work with people in that way? And I was like, well, I need to understand psychology, and I need to understand kinesiology and anatomy and physiology and sociology. And then I studied anthropologically, I studied like cross-cultural views of stress and how we understand how stress shows up in the body, and how different that is culturally. So I don't remember that woman's name, and I wish I did, because I would go back and give her a big hug and thank her, because it completely it changed my life, and it redirected my understanding of how to bring a wholeness to the yoga practice. Mind, body, heart, spirit, all of it, in a way that I wouldn't have gotten just from practicing yoga.
That's exactly what I was curious about, because when I think back to 2002, there was not a lot, everybody was postural and structural. Mm-hmm. And the yoga wasn't really, it was definitely, at least for me at that point, I'm sure there was other people who were different, it wasn't like a somatic exploration. It was very much about accomplishing forms and kind of climbing a ladder of being able to do stuff on the mat. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, for you, starting to teach it in 1998, where were you? Where were you when you taught in 1998?
Yeah, I was at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. I was a student there. And I had been a gymnast when I was a kid. And one of the sister of the guy that I was dating, she went to yoga. And she was like, you should come with me. And I didn't know anything about it. And I went with her, and I was totally hooked. And I ended up, there was one yoga teacher in Williamsburg at that time, and her name was Rosie Taylor. And I just started going to every class she taught. And similar to what I've heard on some of your other conversations, it was when she couldn't teach, when she was sick or when she had to travel, she'd say, hey, can you just come in and take over this class for me? Because I was the one that, I basically had memorized every word she ever spoke because I was there all the time. Right. So that's how I started teaching. And then I studied one-on-one under her for the 4 years that I was there. I would go to her house for like a half a day a week, every Monday afternoon, and she would teach me everything she knew. So I didn't take a formal training until 4 years into teaching.
Exactly. Me too. I started teaching in around, 96, 97. I didn't do a training until much later, like you. And it's interesting how that happened, because what were those classes like that you were going to? Was it like a particular tradition
She had studied Iyengar yoga with Kofi Bhuja. Okay. And she called what she did Iyengar with heart. So she brought to it a little bit more of the spirituality and emotional, perspective. So it wasn't as rigid, but it was very much, alignment based and holding postures for a long time. And I was studying anatomy at the same time, and biomechanics and physiology. So I just thought it was like the coolest lab to go in to practice yoga and be like, oh, that's that muscle. Oh, that's how the spine feels, because I was doing cadaver anatomy and opening up bodies and looking at things. So then I would go into practice, and I felt like I had a three-dimensional view of my insides that just deepened the practice so much.
Wow, that's interesting too that she said Iyengar with heart, because I have a conversation that's this week with Donna Fari about the Iyengar method and sort of some baked in things that are sometimes there where there's a bit of a somatic dominance to it. So the fact that you have to add some heart right. might make some sense, and nice for you, because it doesn't sound like she was hitting you or slapping you or like, riding you for not folding your blanket properly and stuff like that.
No, not at all. And, I'd come from that in gymnastics. So had she done that, I would have bailed after class one. I was over it at that point. I needed someone to teach me how to be kind.
All right, so yoga was sort of your thing even early in your college days, and then you just used your studies to try to help it even back then.
Yeah.
And all right, so did you finish your degree? Did you finish that?
I did. That was the deal. Actually, that was the deal I made with the dean. She said, if you design this degree and we approve it, you have to shake on it that you'll graduate. And they approved it, and I graduated.
You held to it, and you're probably good for it, I'm sure, because it's so interesting because nowadays there's such a conversation around how 200-hour teacher trainings are inadequate.
Right.
And so, again, at that time, 200-hour trainings didn't even really start until like 97 or something. That's like when they first showed up.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that for whatever reason, you kind of did some of the work that everybody's saying yoga teachers should be doing now, but you did it back before anybody was saying we should do it.
Right. And I feel so lucky to have had a teacher who was interested in, I think, she was in her late 40s, I think, at that time, and she saw in me someone who really got it and really wanted to go deep. And she had the generosity to do that for me. And, I think one-on-one mentorship really is a phenomenal way to learn. And then when I went on to do my 200-hour, I was just checking a box. Like I didn't learn about myself in that, nor did I learn how can you learn that much about the postures and the wholeness of the practice, So I checked the box, and that was, but I really learned how to teach through that relationship.
And that teacher training that you did, where did you do that?
I did that. The studio was in Maine. I lived in New Hampshire at the time, and it was with a woman named Kim Valerie, and she is also from the Iyengar tradition, but also she didn't say Iyengar with heart, but I would say that for her. That was an accurate statement.
Well, I'm going to tell you that there's just been a crazy weird convergence because I have met Kim Valerie before.
Have you really?
Didn't she used to be in like Massachusetts?
Yeah, And the training that I don't know, I can't remember if she lived in Maine or she just offered it in Maine. But yeah, she's in the Northeast.
Well, I once, many years ago, one of the very first times someone extended an invitation for me to travel as a yoga teacher was to Kim Valerie's Yoga Spirit Studios in Massachusetts.
Wow.
And
that is funny.
I have this memory of it was that very first time you're a very green new teacher, you've been teaching for maybe a year and a half, 2 years, and I was doing the core faculty gig at Omega. I know you've taught at Omega too, so those morning and evening classes, like the core faculty teacher, I was doing that gig. And one of her teachers came to my classes there and facilitated it and emailed me and invited me to come teach workshops. And that was the first time that had ever happened for me. And I was like, oh my God, my yoga career is starting. And it was launched at Yoga Spirit Studios. But here's the crazy thing. I got in trouble because I used cuss words. And people were upset, and Kim was upset because she was like, this is a space for children. We don't use those kind of words here. And I was young and punky and kind of punk rocky and was just having fun and didn't think,
Right. That is one of those funny convergence moments that,
Yes, my mind is kind of flashing back on stuff, which is what I was saying. For me, these conversations are about kind of the thing where you eat the tea cake and your mind flashes back to things that happened in your life.
Well, yeah, and it's why I enjoy listening to your podcast, because these are people too that I feel like I've moved in circles with for years, but some of them I've talked to in elevators at conferences, or we've emailed each other, or we've taught together in the same stage, but I don't really know any of them. But hearing their stories, I'm like, oh yeah, it's those of us who were around in the late 90s and early aughts. It was kind of a small community then. It
was certainly not as spread out because there wasn't the internet in the same way. It was early days. But I guess I'm looking ahead, and I'm seeing that you do go on to get another degree in 2007. But what do you do from 2002 to 2007? Are you just teaching yoga?
I was teaching yoga, and I was also guiding. Well, I was an experiential educator. So if I wasn't teaching yoga, I was out in the field, and I was teaching rock climbing, and I was leading backpacking trips, and I was working with adjudicated youth in the wilderness. So I kind of had two concurrent paths at that point. One was in the studio teaching, and one was in nature, working with groups. And they were, to me, it was the same thing. It was experiential learning about oneself and on a deeper level. And eventually I had to pick one because of finances. Like I couldn't, the experiential education in the field required being gone for weeks at a time. And so that made it difficult to hold a studio job, right? Mm-hmm. So I ended up choosing yoga. So I was mostly teaching yoga. I was also just trying to figure my shit out because I'd gotten married early, and then I'd gotten divorced I got married when I was 21, and I divorced at 23, and I was lost. So I was just trying to figure myself out. And so I was, other than professionally doing what I was doing, I was also trying to use my yoga practice in a way to get to the heart of myself and my time in nature, to kind of push my own limits and be more connected to something bigger than me. And so I say that because that personal struggle I went through was really informative in terms of what I then went on to study and why things turned out the way they did for me professionally.
I appreciate that a lot, because I'm often talking about that too when I start these workshops with people, that I have this idea that someone has their own personal into yoga. There's a reason why you're interested in it. Mm-hmm. And for me as well, like you, there was deep difficulties and tragedies. My mom passed away, and you're trying to figure yourself out at age 22 or 23 or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you're doing this deep searching, and sometimes going downward spirals into dark places. At least I was. Right. Yeah. And so to yoga became like a vehicle to figure shit out.
Absolutely. And what I ended up finding was it wasn't enough. Right? For me, yoga wasn't enough for me to figure stuff out. It was enough for me to meet myself, which I desperately needed to do. And it was enough for me to learn how to actually stay in my body. But I needed the more of the grittiness that I got from the outdoor world, and I also needed therapy. Just legit, straight up, individual and group therapy, because I found that the yoga community it really helped me to open up and wake up to my spiritual side. I hadn't been raised religious or spiritual in any way, and I found great healing in opening to that side of myself. But man, was I was spiritually bypassing a lot of stuff because of that's, in the yoga world, it was kind of like everything is light and love, and we're all good. And
those years especially, because it was really on the upswing, the boom was really launching upwards, and everybody was starting brands. We all went from having something like Grit and Grace to just yourname.com. Right. You know what I mean? There was exactly. we all did that. Yeah. Wow. So so you're teaching, where are you? Are you still in New Hampshire, you said?
I was only in New Hampshire for a year because I got divorced, and then I moved west, and I moved to Bend, Oregon, and then Portland, Oregon. So in my 20s, I was mostly in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And then I went to graduate school, which was in Arizona, but I traveled there, so I was still living in Portland and building community there and teaching. I was kind of teaching all over I think I taught at almost every studio you could have taught at that point.
Well, my sister lived in Bend for a little while. Now she lives in Vancouver, Washington. So I've been there before, not spent a lot of time there. But it's interesting to me because I'm looking at what you studied when you traveled to Arizona to do this master's degree. And another one of these like convergent points happens for me because your whole thesis was about developing this educational model where you trust and act on a sense of inner knowing.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of really into that notion, but you always have to be careful about it because it sometimes makes it sound a little bit like magical thinking, like just listen to your body, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like it's not that fluffy thing that you and I were talking about that we were reacting against, but it's always interesting to me the way teachers, they focus and study the thing that they need the most, you know?
Yes.
So coming from some sort of place in myself where I feel like I make a decision that I don't have regrets about and feels like a right decision, was sort of what it boiled down to for me. And it seems like you too.
Yeah. And that was the beginning of that exploration into what I can now articulate is developing a trustworthy relationship with myself. And, you know, at that time, I did write this thesis that was, you know, book length, and I had been asked to publish it, and I was like, you know what, I don't think I want to publish this because there was some sense in me that it was something I wouldn't want out there in the world in like 10 years. You know, it was a very important investigation for me, and looking back, I'm kind of glad I didn't publish it because it still was a little on the fluffy side in spirituality, in the sense that I think my personal exploration of trying to come to terms with myself after that divorce really was spiritual, in the sense that I didn't know how to have a healthy relationship with myself. So I kind of looked to this relationship with the larger world, with the ineffable, with the thing that's in all of us, and kind of hung my hat on that as that's the relationship we're trying to cultivate. And once I wrote the thesis, and then I moved to California and I started working with a different therapist, and I started learning more about, at this point, like the neurobiology and how our brains work and stuff, that's when I started to go, you know what, I think I'm actually talking about a relationship with myself. And yes, it's inclusive of something that's bigger than me, but I think I was just too overwhelmed and terrified by the idea that I might actually have how do I want to say that just to like put my trust in me, like a person, you know?
There's a faith element, isn't there?
Right, yeah.
Which, you know, I don't say that like blind faith, but at some point you have to trust in and see, I was just about to say trust in yourself. How cheesy does that sound?
Exactly.
But it's interesting to me too, because like you, I didn't go to the science as much as you did. Like I studied anatomy some, but sometimes the anatomy kind of sucked the magic out of it for me. I went into like sort of studying philosophy more. But it does seem like you went more like a science direction. And, you know, just recently I had Marlisa Sullivan on talking about polyvagal theory. And I know that's a big thing with you too. Was one of those ways that you began to have more trust in yourself?
Yeah, understanding. So where do I want to go with that? For me, at first, it was the anatomy. And it was feeling like I listened to your conversation with Godfrey too about alignment and how that's, you know, it's a dangerous place to kind of say this is what it's about. And what I would say is, for me, I had the sense that when I found my alignment in my body, whatever that was in different shapes, there was a yes, there was a resonance that was like, oh, here I am. You know, it's like finding the way that I was built to inhabit myself, helped me to inhabit myself. So that's where the anatomy piece came in for me, and why I geeked out on it so hard, because I felt like if you could understand the structure, you could find a more nuanced experience of yourself. And then that led into understanding more about the structure and the functioning of the nervous system and the brain, and finding that as I understood more the thing that makes everyone the same, right, this internal wiring, as I understood that more, I could understand my own selfness more, if that makes sense. You know, like there was less blame attached and less like these challenges I have, these aren't necessarily personality flaws, you know, or this is behavior that goes right along with a physiological state. And this is, you know, how anyone's brain would have developed if they had had similar experiences to mine. And I've found that to be true in bringing this work and that information to the clients that I work with. It's like there's some absolution, right? Like, oh, so this is how the insides work. Now I can kind of set aside the shit talking I do to myself and just get down to business and start relating to myself. You know?
What's the shit talking?
Just speaking to, you know, how critical most of us are of ourselves, right? Like the inner relationship most of us have with ourselves is not the kindest, or most generous. We tend to relate to other people that we love a lot more generously than we do to ourselves. And so just speaking to, you know, the way that we have what I call these different strategic selves that kind of are, they're like really trying to support us in getting our needs met in terms of feeling like we're safe and that we belong and that we're respected. But they just have these really outdated techniques that are not the kindest or not the most useful in terms of what we want for ourselves present day. Does that make sense?
It does. And it kind of goes back to somewhere where I started with you, because to me, that idea of my body is kind of like being machine-like, or like a postural structural thing that on some level is a denial of the wonder or something, is a diminishing in a sense.
It can be.
That's, for me it was, but this idea of biopsychosocial, and I love the way that you, when I'm like picking apart your bio, you're touching to like important, like your divorce and what was happening with you as a person. Because I'm always curious about that, because that's what shapes people's choices, you know? That's where you were at, what was going on. And that's what shapes people's viewpoints as teachers, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it was so, it was such a wake-up call for me, in the sense of realizing I had no sense of who I was. You know, I felt like and I couldn't have told you that before, but it was like I had started practicing yoga when I was 18, and it felt like meeting myself for the first time. And over the years, those first few years, I really started to come to this understanding of my inner life and how my inner world and my outer world didn't really match. And so the influence was like, how did that happen? You know, how did I get to a place where, in the first place, I didn't really have a relationship to an inner world? And then how does one match their insides with their outsides, you know, in a way that is like not full of effort?
Yes, or doesn't feel like it doesn't match, you know? Like,
right.
Because sometimes you're making an effort to match the inside, but I know what you mean. There was that process of, I remember I was in a band for a while, and I was so desperate for everybody to like me. And I remember them at one point sort of sitting me down and being like, hey man, you know, we like you, or you wouldn't be in the band. You don't have to try so hard. And it was like really loving though, you know what I mean? Like I stayed in that band, like I wasn't, and it was super uncomfortable. Like your reaction just now was exactly how it felt. Like I was like, oh no, I'm a fucking idiot. But like, it was really good moment, you know? It was like, oh, okay, like what I was on the outside was not at all matching what was on the inside, and they actually liked what was on. They could see what was on the inside better than I could in a way. And getting them to match. And it's interesting how yoga teaching. I've often said, I have an acting background, and there's a certain performative element of being a yoga teacher, right? And I've always felt like the performance that I give when I'm a yoga teacher is basically trying to be the best version of me that I know. And that's who I'm like, and sometimes I feel like that's who I am, and sometimes maybe, but and I'm trying to get it to match, like you're saying, the inside and the outside. I think it's very astute, and a lot of what yoga practice is about for me. Certainly more of that than, that's why I soured on alignment as a focus. Like you said earlier, when you feel the alignment, it's like you associated with that a feeling that you have. And does that mean like your knee's in a particular place and then you have to put your knee back in that place again? Or does it change alignment?
Oh, good question. Yeah, my experience is that it's changed over time as my body changes. And, I think there's some fundamental alignment principles that are fairly steady. But, for me, the first book that really rang true to me was Eric Schiffman's book, the Spirit and Practice of Moving into Stillness. And he talked about finding the alignment from the inside out, right? And kind of talking about it in terms of an energetic sensation that when you are in the correct alignment, your insides flow differently. There's like as if the energetic flow hasn't been interrupted or kinked up, right? And so that was it. I think I always mixed that inquiry of what does this feel like? Where do I feel like I'm not inhibiting myself? I always brought that together with what do I know on a biomechanical level, right? So it was neither one or the other entirely.
Well, that's interesting to me. That feeling that you're describing, I want to say that's what Sthira Sukha is. That feeling of balanced effort, or what some people might call embodiment, or that it's that sensation of being sort of wholly present in this very balanced way, where there's this strength but this ease to it.
Yes. Yeah.
And that to me is why I do asana, is to identify that feeling for myself and then see if I can be more consistent with summoning it, and it's interesting to me because I'm going back to this because I think you like me, we found our way to some things before the industry did. Like we both came into our adulthood right alongside yoga going into the mainstream.
Right.
So, at that time in yoga teacher trainings, it was 5 points to your down dog. There was none of what we're talking about right now. I don't know about you. That wasn't in my teacher training.
Nope.
And not to say anything bad about the people who are doing those trainings. It's just like everybody was mainstreaming yoga, and the way that it was getting more popularized was to sort of boil it down and standardize it,
Right.
So it could sell better, basically.
Yeah.
But you're pointing to these really subtle nuances. And I'm wondering for you, did that become at odds with each other? Because it did for me, where the industry is wanting me to give more of a workout kind of class, but my practice and experience is leading me in a different direction. And at some point, I had to make a choice there.
Yes. Yeah, and I would say it showed up in different ways. I mean, the first time I remember, it was about 10 years ago. I remember I had a crisis of teaching because I just had this sense that I can't teach what I want to teach in a classroom setting. Like, I have to teach one-on-one. There's no way that I could address true what my experience of yoga was in terms of in a class setting. And Why?
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but why was that? And
Why
was
not?
that before you wrote Teaching People Not Poses, or after you wrote that?
It was before, right before.
Okay. And so what was it about teaching those classes that you were finding so problematic?
Well, because I was finding that there's no prescription for all, you know, and that I knew that my personal practice was evolving, and I was more and more interested in facilitating a really intimate connection with self. And what I didn't know was that I just didn't know enough of how to do it yet in a group setting. And I think, you know, kind of like what you were speaking about with Marlisa and yoga therapy, like I think there is some part of one-on-one practice that really is just a lot more diagnostic, and you can reach the individual. But I also think I agree with what you were saying to her in the sense that how yoga therapy is generally defined is what I think a yoga class should be. And I just didn't have the skill set to do it yet. And that's when I started going and doing more study and training and outside of the yoga sphere, because I didn't see it there. You know, that's when I started learning more with my very dear friend Mandy Blake, and she's done the neuroscience research and the embodiment, and she comes through the somatic field, which has a lineage through Aikido and not yoga. So I started learning more of that and applying it in the yoga world, because I didn't see anyone at the time really doing that. So all that to say, you know, I had that crisis of teaching because I didn't know enough to do what I wanted to do. It's like, you know, when you're a writer and you read something beautiful and you're like, oh, I just can't write that. You know, like I can see that that's amazing, but I can't do that.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.